just very survival been bringing it under candlelight. The women of 18th century Europe built their beauty from poison and perfume. Their faces glowed like porcelain, powdered with lead, bringing in air, painted with Mercury, and scented with dreams of eternity. Behind every mirror lay a secret, that elegance was a mask, bringing in and youth a fragile illusion bought with slow decay. In gilded rooms thick with rosewater and deceit, beauty was not vanity, it was power, survival, depended on bringing in and rebellion wrapped in silk. This is the story of the empire of powder, where desire shimmered brighter than reason, bringing and every face hid the quiet price of perfection. The chamber was still, except for the faint hiss of candles and the soft rustle of silk. A mirror, tall, gilded, and speckled with age, reflected a pale figure leaning close to its glass. The woman's face, bare for only a moment, was transformed by her hand, a dusting of white powder, the slow sweep of a brush, the soft red bloom upon her lips. Around her, the table gleamed with bottles and jars, their contents glimmering faintly in the candlelight. Some held crushed pearls, others powders as white as snow, and a few, though she did not know it, held death. This was Europe in the 18th century, an age of elegance, of powdered wigs and velvet gowns, of manners and masks. Beauty was not merely admired, it was demanded. In drawing rooms and court salons, appearance was a kind of language, one that spoke of wealth, virtue, and belonging. To be beautiful was to be seen, and to be seen was to survive. The 18th century worshipped artifice. Pale skin was prized not as a symbol of health, but of privilege, proof that one did not labor beneath the sun. A nobler woman's complexion was her calling card, her weapon, her protection. The powder that cloaked her face, fine and fragrant, was both armor and disguise. Beneath it, the truth, fatigue, worry, illness could be hidden from view. Each morning, the ritual began. Servants entered bearing trays of water, brushes, and crystal pots. The mistress sat before her toilette, a small altar of silver and silk, and submitted to transformation. Her hair was powdered with flour or starch until it shimmered like frost. Her face, once human, became porcelain, smooth, pale, expressionless. Rouge lent her the illusion of vitality. Scent masked the stillness of her painted skin. Every gesture was slow, deliberate, ceremonial, but beauty, like power, demanded sacrifice. The powders that created this perfect pallor were made from white lead, a substance long known to craftsmen and alchemists for its brightness and deadly charm. The rouge, vivid and seductive, often contained mercury salts that corroded the flesh beneath. Yet in an era when knowledge and danger walked hand in hand, few questioned their use. To appear flawless was worth the risk. The fashion for cosmetics did not belong to women alone. Men of rank and title, courtiers, ambassadors, poets, also powdered their faces and scented their wigs. Beauty was a shared performance, a mirror in which society admired itself. To appear natural was to appear vulgar. To appear artificial was to appear divine. In the grand salons of Paris, London, and Vienna, beauty was the currency of power. A woman could rise by her grace as swiftly as she could fall by her appearance. A streak of uneven color, a blemish, a trace of fatigue. These were not mere imperfections, but social risks. The face became a battlefield, and cosmetics the weapons of survival. Apothecaries grew rich crafting their secret recipes. Potions labeled Venetian ceruse, milk of roses, or pale water. Behind the pretty names were mixtures of chalk, vinegar, and metals ground into fine dust. Perfume makers worked beside them, blending ambergris, civet, and crushed petals into fragrances that masked more than scent. They concealed the faint odor of decay that heavy cosmetics often brought. Yet even as the powders dulled the senses and clouded the skin, they created a vision that few could resist. Portraits of the age show faces smooth as porcelain, lips the color of pomegranate, and eyes half-lidded in serenity. It was not beauty as nature made it. It was beauty remade, controlled, perfected by artifice. In this world, mirrors did not reflect truth, they reflected rank. A noblewoman before her mirror did not see herself. She saw what the world demanded of her: serenity, purity, control. The mirror became her judge, her confidante, her silent accomplice. As dawn broke over the rooftops of Paris, the woman before the glass placed a tiny patch, a velvet mouch shaped like a crescent moon, on her cheek. It was a statement, a code, a flirtation. She smiled faintly at her reflection, satisfied that she had achieved the delicate illusion of effortless grace. Outside, the carriages of the morning rolled across cobblestones, slick with mist. The city awakened. In every mansion, in every chamber of the powerful, another candle flickered before another mirror. The ritual repeated. Beauty was prepared, displayed, and slowly destroyed. No one questioned it, not yet, for in that age, artifice was truth. And behind every painted face lay the same quiet secret that perfection, like powder, was only dust waiting to fall. The origins of 18th century beauty were not found in salons or ballrooms, but in darker, quieter places. The workshops of alchemists, the chambers of apothecaries, and the back rooms of perfumers where glass jars lined the walls like jewels. The men who worked there believed themselves part scientist, part magician. They ground, distilled, and blended the world into powders and oils, convinced that within every mineral and blossom lay a secret capable of transforming flesh into art. Long before the 18th century dawned, beauty had been a mark of divine favor. In medieval courts, pale skin signified piety. In Renaissance portraits, it spoke of grace and intellect. But by the time the Enlightenment spread across Europe, beauty had become something more ambitious. It was an achievement, something to be engineered. If nature did not grant perfection, human ingenuity would create it. In Paris, the apothecary's shop stood between the realms of medicine and illusion. Shelves overflowed with jars labeled in Latin: Cerussa alba, aqua mirabilis, spiritus lavendula. Behind the counter, apprentices stirred mixtures of lead carbonate into creamy pastes, which promised to smooth wrinkles and brighten the complexion. The ladies who visited these shops came veiled, their identities concealed. For to buy beauty was to confess imperfection, and in a world ruled by appearance, that was a delicate confession indeed. The recipes for these powders were guarded like royal secrets. Some were said to come from Venice, where women's faces glowed like marble under the lamps of St. Mark's Square. Others were whispered to originate in Spain or the East, brought by merchants who carried silk, spices, and mysterious vials. Yet regardless of their claimed origin, the ingredients were often the same: white lead for brightness, vinegar for smoothness, and occasionally a touch of arsenic to achieve a flawless sheen. Perfume, too, became an art of deception. In crowded cities, where open drains and unwashed garments mingled with the scent of roasted meats and burning tallow, fragrance was both luxury and armor. The nobleman's coat might smell faintly of orange blossom, his gloves of violet. A lady's hair could carry the scent of rosewater, jasmine, or amber. Every gesture left a trail of scent. Every conversation unfolded within an invisible cloud of artifice. Cleanliness was not yet a daily habit, but perfume made it seem so. By mid-century, entire industries had risen to serve this hunger for perfection. In London, the perfumers of Bond Street advertised milk of roses and lily of the valley water to brighten the skin and soothe the spirit. In Paris, the marchandises de mode sold not only gowns and ribbons, but beauty powders imported from Venice and Florence. And in Vienna and St. Petersburg, noblewomen ordered their cosmetics from France, convinced that only Paris knew the true secret of allure. Yet behind this glittering commerce lay a truth more complex. The ingredients that made these powders so desirable also made them dangerous. Physicians had long warned that lead, when applied to the skin, could seep into the body and sicken the blood. But such warnings were easy to ignore when the alternative was social invisibility. To appear pale and smooth was not vanity. It was survival in a world where status could fade as quickly as a complexion. Even men of intellect were seduced by this culture of appearance. Philosophers debated beauty as if it were a science. Artists painted powdered faces not as masks, but as symbols of refinement and control. To be painted was to be immortalized, and the ideal portrait was not of a person, but of an illusion. The subject's eyes glimmered with reason, their skin glowed like porcelain. The artist, the apothecary, and the subject were united in one pursuit, the perfection of the human image. Inside the royal courts, this obsession reached its height. In Versailles, the toilette was not a private act, but a performance. Courtiers gathered to witness the queen's transformation each morning, admiring the precision of her gestures and the artistry of her appearance. Servants powdered her hair until clouds of white rose around her like mist. Her face was touched with rouge, her lips with carmine. She was no longer a woman. She was an ideal made flesh. The world outside the palace walls followed her example. Across Europe, women imitated the style of queens and duchesses, often with cheaper, harsher imitations of their cosmetics. Poorer women used chalk instead of ceruse or ground rice flour for powder. The results were the same pale faces, reddened cheeks, and a slow, unseen toll on the body. But no one spoke of that. To speak of danger was to break the illusion, and illusions were the lifeblood of the age. Beauty, once a gift of nature, had become a project of artifice. It was no longer enough to be born beautiful. One had to construct it, layer by layer, morning by morning, until the face became a kind of sculpture. And beneath every mask lay the same quiet fear that without it, one might vanish from notice altogether. As the century advanced, this fear only deepened. The mirror, that silent companion, reflected not only vanity but dependence. Powder by powder, perfume by perfume, Europe's nobility had built a world of delicate fayades. And somewhere beneath the powder, a dangerous truth began to stir. That the pursuit of beauty might be consuming the very lives it sought to perfect. The powder looked innocent enough, a soft, pearly dust that shimmered faintly when caught in the morning light. It rested in crystal jars and ivory boxes, its surface smooth as snow. To the touch it was cool, delicate, pure. No one could have guessed that within its brightness lay the slow poison of vanity, a powder that promised beauty, yet whispered of decay. White lead, Cerussa alba, was the heart of 18th century allure. It was found in the paint boxes of artists, the workshops of apothecaries, and the dressing tables of noblewomen. Made by suspending strips of metal over vinegar and horse dung until a white crust formed upon their surface. It was an alchemical triumph, lead transformed into light. When ground and mixed with oil or water, it created a smooth paste that clung to the skin like porcelain. It was said that Venetian women had first perfected its use. Under the burning Italian sun, they had long prized paleness as the mark of nobility. Their formula, known as Venetian ceruse, was rumored to be so refined that even under candlelight it gave the illusion of youth and purity. But by the 18th century, the secret had traveled far beyond Venice, finding eager admirers in Paris, London, and Vienna, cities where mirrors multiplied and appearance ruled like law. In the boudoirs of Paris, noblewomen began their mornings with the ritual of transformation. Servants prepared the paste, blending it with water until it reached the perfect consistency. The lady sat before her mirror, her hair pinned high, her face bare. With a fine brush or sponge, she spread the white mixture across her cheeks, forehead, and neck, careful not to miss a single inch. The sensation was strange, cool, heavy, almost theatrical. Then came the rouge, the powder, the patch. In the mirror, a new being emerged. Faultless, unearthly, untouchable. Artists adored it. The faces of the age, serene, pale, untouched by time, glowed with the same luminous pallor. The portraits of Gainsborough, Nattier, and Vijay Lebrun immortalized this ideal. Under layers of white paint, women appeared eternal, frozen in a perfection that nature never granted. Viewers saw purity, the painters saw art. Few wondered whether the glow of the sitter's face came from artifice or from the very poison that would one day erase it. Physicians, of course, had their doubts. In their journals, they recorded strange cases, women who grew weak and pale beyond fashion, whose lips darkened, whose hair thinned and fell, whose skin broke into ghostly patches. They called it cosmetic sickness. But few listened. Beauty, after all, was its own defense. If lead be poison, one fashionable lady was said to remark, "Then I shall die beautiful." The power of white lead was not only in its illusion, but in what it represented. To wear it was to declare oneself above the natural world, untouched by sun, wind, or toil. It separated those who labored from those who ruled. The pallor it produced was not merely aesthetic, it was political. Every powdered cheek proclaimed wealth, leisure, and control. The more lifeless the skin appeared, the higher its status. Factories across Europe rose to meet the demand. In London, entire families worked to produce the fine white flakes that would become face powder. In Paris, merchants sold lead by the pound to cosmetic makers, who blended it with vinegar and perfumed oils. It was a thriving trade, elegant, profitable, and quietly destructive. As months turned to years, users of white lead began to suffer. Their skin grew grey beneath the powder's brightness. Their gums receded, their teeth loosened. The more they tried to conceal these signs with paint, the worse the effects became. Lead absorbed through the skin did its silent work within the body, numbing the limbs, clouding the mind, weakening the heart. Yet even as the evidence mounted, fashion remained unmoved. The mirror demanded perfection, and perfection required powder. The contradiction of the age was cruelly simple. What preserved beauty destroyed it. The very substance that created the illusion of vitality stole it away grain by grain. Women grew fragile under their masks, their beauty both weapon and wound. And still, they powdered, smiling faintly as if daring the world to notice what lay beneath. It was not vanity alone that bound them to this ritual. It was expectation. In a society built upon performance, the face was a stage upon which one's worth was measured daily. A lady without powder might be mistaken for ill or impoverished. To appear unadorned was to appear undone. And so, the jars were open. The powder was brushed on, and the lie was renewed each morning. Beneath the candlelight of an evening ball, the illusion reached its height. Faces glowed like moonlight, lips shone crimson, eyes glittered beneath fans of dark lashes. The air was thick with perfume and powdered starch, a haze of luxury and deception. Music swelled. Laughter shimmered, and in that dazzling blur, no one could tell that behind the glow of white lead, an entire generation was slowly fading away. The dream of beauty was, quite literally, a white dream, soft, silent, and deadly. And as the century advanced, the fashion only deepened, becoming a ritual that not even reason or warning could unmake. The age of enlightenment had turned its gaze towards science, philosophy, and progress. But in the mirror, the old alchemy of illusion still reigned supreme, bringing in a. If white lead was the mask of purity, then rouge was the heartbeat beneath it. The illusion of life painted upon an otherwise ghostly face, bringing in the 18th century, color was not merely an adornment, it was a declaration. Rouge was the bridge between artifice and allure, bringing in the one touch of vitality allowed in a world devoted to pale perfection. A dab of red upon the cheek could suggest youth, health, joy, bringing in or even scandal, depending on how it was worn and by whom. The ritual of rouge began where the white powder ended, bringing in after the face was coated in its pale armor, a servant would take a tiny pot, often porcelain, bringing in painted with golden flowers, and open it carefully. Inside lay the red dense, glistening paste made from carmine or vermilion, depended on bringing in Sometimes it came from cochineal, the crushed bodies of insects imported from Spanish America, sometimes from mercury sulfide ground to a fine, vivid dust. To the ladies of the age, such origins were irrelevant. What mattered was the color, that perfect, bringing in pulsating into scarlet that turned a porcelain face into something human again. Applied with a fingertip or a soft brush, there's very survival to bringing in the rouge brought warmth where none existed. The placement was everything. On the upper cheeks it meant vitality, nearer the temples flirtation, des vergevival, below the eye melancholy. The art of rouge was a language was one only the initiated could read. In salons and royal courts, they just very survival did on bringing in a women learned to communicate without words. A touch more color at the ball could suggest passion, a faint trace at breakfast, restraint. Bringing in a rouge carried contradictions that mirrored the century itself. It symbolized life, yet was made from poison. It represented natural beauty, depended on bringing in a yet announced its own artifice. To wear it boldly was to court gossip, to wear it sparingly was to risk invisibility. Village's very survival depended on bringing in a the right shade could elevate a woman's reputation, the wrong one could destroy it. The village's very survival on bringing in even men joined the practice, and diplomats brushed their cheeks with a subtle tint before appearing in public, bringing in a lest they appear fatigued or indifferent. In Paris, rouge became an industry as powerful as perfume. Bringing in a entire streets were devoted to its production and sale. The most celebrated brands came in tiny boxes labeled Rouge de Chine, Carmen Superior. Survival depended on bringing Emma. Wealthy patrons commissioned their own custom blends, some with a sheen of pearl dust, bringing in a others scented faintly with roses or amber. It was not uncommon for a lady to own a dozen shades of red, bringing in a each chosen for a different hour of the day or mood of the season. In England, however, the practice drew controversy. In the rising middle class, practical, moral, and newly prosperous, began to associate rouge with the excesses of the aristocracy. To them, bringing in a painted faces were symbols of decadence, deceit, and idleness. Bringing in a pamphleteers railed against the mask of vice and called for a return to natural beauty. But fashion has a way of ignoring morality. Very survival depended on the more it was condemned, the more desirable it became. The London elite, ever hungry for continental refinement, soon followed the Parisian lead. The village's very survival depending bringing in importing rouge by the crate. The fascination with red was ancient, the color of blood, vitality, and divine energy. But in the 18th century, their survival depended on bringing it took on new meanings. It was the shade of flirtation, the blush of secrets, the symbol of control in a world ruled by performance. The village's very survival depended on bringing in to rouge one's cheeks was to rewrite one's emotions, to choose what others saw, to decide what passion looked like. Then the voluntary survival depended on bringing in even the act itself was intimate, a woman alone before her mirror, pressing color into her pale reflection, breathing life into her creation. Bringing in painters adored this symbolism. In portraits of the era, a faint flush across the cheek became a signature of femininity and refinement. Very survival depended on bringing in the rouge did not merely beautify, it narrated, it told of wealth, leisure, and the mastery of artifice. In portraits of queens and courtesans alike, a village's very survival depended on bringing in the same red shimmered, a quiet rebellion against the lifeless pallor demanded by fashion. And yet, like the powders that came before it, bringing in rouge carried its cost. The vermilion and carmine that gave such brilliance often caused inflammation or irritation when worn daily. Some women, bringing in desperate for deeper color, experimented with home recipes, mixing vinegar with crushed strawberries or wine with iron filings. Depended on bringing in the results were unpredictable, a perfect flush one day, a burning rash the next. But beauty was not a choice, it was an expectation. Bringing in by the late 18th century, rouge became a kind of armor against uncertainty. The century was shifting, revolutions stirred, fortunes collapsed. But the faith on bringing in empires trembled, but the face remained calm, composed, eternally composed. Beneath layers of powder and rouge, depended on bringing in the nobility maintained the illusion of control even as their world began to fracture. Bringing in the mirror reflected not truth but endurance, the power to remain beautiful as everything else fell away. And so, each morning, the ritual continued. The village survival and bringing in the jar of white lead opened first, the brush swept softly across the face. Then came the rouge, a bloom of red upon a field of white, depended on bringing in delicate as the first blush of dawn. For a few brief hours the illusion would hold, until heat, time, or truth dissolved it once again. Depended on bringing in rouge was not just painting, it was history pressed into the skin, a story of longing, deception, and the unrelenting desire to appear untouchable. Bringing in its shimmer lived both art and tragedy, both admiration and exhaustion. And as Europe turned its gaze toward revolution and reason, depended on bringing in it would soon discover that the face of beauty, so carefully crafted, so perfectly false, was also the mask of its own decline. Garrick and Viden, a word was spoken or a glance exchanged, The first thing noticed in the salons of the 18th century was scent. Perfume lingered like a signature, depended on bringing in, trailing through the corridors of palaces and along the narrow lanes of Paris. It was invisible, intangible. Elixirs' very survival depended on bringing in yet it defined a person more powerfully than any jewel or title. To smell exquisite was to be remembered. To be remembered was to survive. Bringing in the century was an age of contradiction. Obsessed with elegance, yet crowded and unclean. Streets were narrow, the air thick with smoke and refuse. Bringing in bathing was rare, water considered dangerous, even unhealthy. And so perfume rose to prominence not merely as luxury, but necessity. Bringing in it masked the odors of a world that had outgrown its own refinement. Underneath powdered wigs and layers of silk, depended on bringing in scent became the final veil between civilization and the chaos it refused to acknowledge. The art of perfumery, on bringing in once the domain of apothecaries and monks, had become an empire of its own. In Paris, the village's very survival, the Rue Saint-Honoré glittered with boutiques displaying crystal vials and gilded boxes. On bringing in behind their counters stood the new artisans of desire, perfumers who blended chemistry and poetry with equal precision. Depended on bringing in. They called themselves maîtres parfumeurs, masters of scent. Their creations bore names as lyrical as their ingredients eaude heliotrope, bringing in essence de fleurs d'orange or spirit of ambrosia. Each bottle was a promise of freshness, youth, virtue, or intrigue. Depended on bringing in the perfumes of the era were potent, complex, and often heavy mahaks from Asia, ambergris from the ocean, and civet from Africa mixed with rose, jasmine. Depended on bringing in and violet. A single drop on the wrist could last for days, warming on the skin, which is very survival did on bringing in mingling with powder and candlelight until it became something entirely personal. Perfume was chemistry turned into memory. For the elite, depended on bringing in scent was not simply decoration, it was identity. Every noble household had its own preferred blend. Depended on bringing in a fragrance that marked its lineage as surely as a family crest. A duchess might favor the sweetness of orange blossom. Bringing in a marquise might prefer the darkness of myrrh and tobacco. Letters were perfumed before being sealed, gloves soaked in rosewater. Depended on bringing in fans brushed with violet essence so that a single flutter carried a trace of personality through the air. At Versailles, depended on bringing in the art of scent reached divine heights. The royal perfumers were among the most powerful artisans in France, depended on bringing in sworn to guard their formulas as tightly as secrets of state. The queen's apartments were saturated with fragrance. The air a mixture of tuberose, bringing in musk and powdered iris. Even the royal stationery carried her chosen perfume. Wherever she went, bringing in arrived first and lingered long after she departed. The demand was endless, a very survival. Depended on bringing in merchants traveled across continents to bring exotic materials to Europe's perfume houses. From India came sandalwood and patchouli, bringing in from the Ottoman Empire attar of roses, from the Caribbean vanilla and clove. Bringing in the blending of these distant worlds created something intoxicating, a fusion of East and West, nature and artifice. Bringing in each scent told a story of empire and exchange, luxury and labor. To wear perfume was to carry the world itself upon the skin, bringing in But not all fragrances were created equal. The rich could afford oils aged and distilled to perfection. Depended on bringing in The poor bought cheap imitations, mixtures of vinegar and herbs coarse and fleeting. In the crowded quarters of Paris and London, bringing in the air was thick with counterfeit scents, made to mimic the luxuries of the elite. It was a strange democracy, bringing in though society remained divided by wealth, the aroma of power drifted everywhere. Perfume had other, subtler powers as well, bringing in it shaped intimacy and distance, drawing some closer, keeping others at bay. A faint trail of lavender could disarm suspicion, bringing in that the sweetness of rose could soften a command. The perfumed handkerchief, depended on bringing in waved lightly or dropped by accident, became a silent messenger in a world where language was often constrained by etiquette. Depended on bringing in To master scent was to master perception itself. Writers and philosophers of the Enlightenment pondered this invisible empire, depended on bringing in They called perfume the soul's shadow, a reflection of character without form or substance. Some dismissed it as vanity, bringing in Others saw in it the essence of art. The critic Rousseau famously complained that perfume corrupted the senses. The village's survival depended on bringing in while Voltaire called it the final perfection of civilization. Both were right, in their way. Perfume was corruption made exquisite, depended on bringing in As the century advanced, the perfumed world grew denser still. Powdered wigs released plumes of starch scented with orris root, bringing in air. Dresses were stored with sachets of violet petals and crushed cloves. The air in a salon, heavy with fragrance, shimmered like a tangible mist, bringing in air. To enter such a room was to step into another realm, one where the line between person and perfume blurred until it vanished. And yet, the village's very survival depended on bringing in air. Beneath all the opulence, there was something haunting about this devotion to scent. It was not only about pleasure but concealment of the body. The village's very survival depended on bringing in a time of truth. Perfume hid the natural in favor of the ideal. It offered immortality in a bottle. A fragrance that would not age, would not decay. The village's very survival and bringing in air would not betray the mortal beneath the mask. As the lamps of evening flickered across mirrors and powdered shoulders, 18th century Europe was no longer air at all. It was perfume, dense, layered, alive with secrets. Each breath was an illusion. Its Veda did on bringing in air. Each sent a story, each trace a reminder that beauty in this world was never meant to be natural. And in this perfumed haze, Europe dreamed. A dream of elegance, so complete, so intoxicating, that it could not last forever. Village's very survival depended on bringing in air. By the middle of the 18th century, beauty had ceased to be a private indulgence. It had become a form of governance. In the royal courts of Europe, depended on bringing in air. Appearance ruled more decisively than decree. Every face powdered, every ribbon tied, every movement rehearsed, all served the same invisible law. As survival that on bringing in air to be seen was to wield power. Nowhere was this truer than in Versailles. Within its gilded walls, life itself was performance, depended on bringing in air. The kings rising and retiring were public events, choreographed with ritual precision, depended on bringing in air. Courtiers jostled not for military rank or intellectual triumph, but for the honor of handing the monarch a sleeve or basin. And amid this pageantry, depended on bringing in air. Cosmetics were not vanity. They were symbols of participation in the royal illusion. A nobleman's wig, towering and dusted in starch, bringing in air, declared allegiance to the crown. A lady's pale complexion reflected the calm of the monarchy itself. Serene, unchanging, eternal. Each morning, pen and bringing in air. The elite assembled before their mirrors like actors before a stage curtain. The mirror was not glass, it was a portal into politics, bringing in air. The Queen's toilette, that sacred morning ritual, was attended by dozens. Ministers, ambassadors, bringing in air. And visiting dignitaries observed in reverent silence as powders, rouge, and perfume were applied. The act of beautifying had become statecraft, bringing in air. Every gesture conveyed stability, wealth, and divine order. Even the fragrance that lingered in the room carried meaning, an empire distilled into scent, bringing in air. Across the Channel in England, the same transformation occurred on a quieter scale. In London drawing rooms, depended on bringing in air. Ladies of influence arranged their cosmetics beside correspondence and ledgers. Paint and powder were as essential to negotiation as wit and charm. Bringing in air one's face was a statement, not of self but of strategy. Bringing in air. To host a gathering without proper powder or scent was to appear careless with reputation itself. Bringing in air, the language of appearance extended far beyond the palace. Depended on bringing in air. Politicians and philosophers debated morality while wearing wigs powdered white with starch and flour. Depended on bringing in air. The clerks and writers who chronicled the Enlightenment dabbed their cuffs with bergamot and orris root. Even revolutionaries depended on bringing in air, who would later condemn the extravagance of the elite, borrowed its symbols of refinement. Bringing in air. The mask of beauty had become inseparable from the machinery of power. Artists and writers recognized this transformation. In portraits, depended on bringing in air, beauty was portrayed as serene authority. Skin flawless, gaze steady, posture divine. The face no longer belonged to the person it depicted. The village's very survival depended on bringing in air. It belonged to the era's mythology. Each stroke of paint, each layer of powder helped sustain the illusion that order still reigned. Bringing in air. Even as unrest simmered beyond palace gates, to maintain such perfection required an economy of labor hidden behind the scenes. Bringing in air, servants rose before dawn to grind powders, mix rouges, and clean brushes. Perfumers delivered new scents in sealed boxes. The village's very survival depended on bringing in air. Chemists prepared tonics for damaged skin, and wig makers adjusted mountains of hair that could weigh more than a crown itself. The village's very survival depended on bringing in. The work of hundreds was required to sustain the appearance of effortless grace. For the women who lived within this system, depended on bringing in air. Mastery of presentation was a kind of armor. A flawless appearance could silence whispers, open doors, or win protection. Bringing in air. Yet the same perfection that granted access also confined. bringing in a. Their reflection in the mirror was both triumph and trap, a mask that had to be renewed daily, never allowed to crack. In this delicate theater, bringing in a, even failure was meaningful. A faint smudge of rouge, a powder left uneven, a wig slightly askew. These were not small mistakes, depended on bringing in a, but signals of social decline. The face became a ledger upon which fortune was written in color and scent. Beauty, once born of desire, depended on bringing a, had become a duty. By the 1770s, the artifice reached extraordinary heights. Wigs rose in architectural towers adorned with ribbons, feathers, and even miniature ships. Faces gleamed beneath layers of white and rose, their stillness resembling porcelain figurines. Bringing in a. The human form had become an extension of architecture. The body a palace, the face its facade, depended on bringing in a. Europe's elite had built their identities out of powder and pride. But the world beyond the mirrors was changing. The ideals of reason, equality, bringing in a. And revolution began to stir in the streets. Pamphlets mocked the extravagance of painted faces and perfumed wigs. Bringing in a. Philosophers questioned whether a nation so obsessed with surface could survive the weight of truth. Still, inside the gilded rooms, bringing in a. The rituals continued. Powder brushed on, rouge applied, perfume poured. The mask of power held firm, even as its foundations began to tremble. The village's very survival by candlelight, one could still mistake the illusion for eternity. The laughter, the fragrance, bringing in a. The soft gleam of powdered faces. All spoke of a world convinced it could master time itself. But beneath the smooth white sheen, bringing in a. History was already gathering its breath. The powder would one day settle, revealing not perfection, bringing in a. but the fragile humanity that had hidden beneath it all along. Bringing in a. By the late 18th century, beauty had become an experiment, not in nature, but in chemistry. Behind the shimmering elegance of Europe's salons, bringing in a quieter revolution was unfolding in bottles, flasks, and powders. The perfumers, apothecaries, depended on bringing in a, and cosmetic artisans who supplied the nobility had become alchemists of allure. Their laboratories hidden behind velvet storefronts and wrought iron balconies. They depended on bringing in a. Inside these dimly lit rooms, the air was thick with a mingled sense of alcohol, rosewater, mercury, and crushed blossoms. On bringing in a. Glass vessels lined the shelves like tiny cathedrals of temptation. Their contents promised transformation, youth in a jar, charm in a powder, orange's very survival and immortality in a scent. Every bottle was a whisper of hope, and every recipe a secret guarded more fiercely than a royal decree. Bringing in at the center of this trade were the perfumers of Paris, figures both admired and feared. They were chemists, merchants, depended on bringing in a. And confidence to the most powerful women in Europe. They crafted the fragrances of queens and courtesans alike, depended on bringing in a. Adjusting formulas to match the wearer's temperament and influence. A drop too much of one oil could turn admiration into scandal. Precision was power. Bringing in a. Their tools were deceptively simple distillation flasks, alembics, mortars, and pestles. Yet in their hands, depended on bringing in a. These instruments were wands of transformation. From the petals of crushed violets and the resin of benzoin, they conjured softness and seduction. The village's very survival depended on bringing a. From the rind of lemons, they distilled brightness, from ambergris permanence. But beneath the poetic language of scent, they depended on bringing in a. The dangers of chemistry waited patiently. Rouge, once made from harmless vegetable dyes, had evolved into a concoction of lead carbonate and cinnabar. Bringing in its color was irresistible, a deep, warm red that seemed to glow under candlelight. But its cost was invisible. Prolonged use left the skin pale. The village's very survival, and the lips cracked and the body weakened. Yet fashion demanded its use, and beauty rarely paused for caution. Powders grew finer, perfumes stronger, depended on bringing in a. Alcohol-based scents, a relatively new innovation, clung to the skin longer than the old oil infusions. Bringing in a. The wealthy bathed in clouds of cologne, a mixture of citrus oils, herbs, and spirit, believing it purified not only the body but also the soul. The village's very survival depended on bringing in a. Physicians cautioned against such indulgence, yet even they kept vials of lavender and vinegar near their desks. Bringing in a. Unable to resist the illusion of freshness in an age before hygiene. As the century progressed, science began to flirt openly with beauty. Bringing in a. Chemists presented their discoveries to fashionable audiences, explaining how metals could color cosmetics. Bringing in a. Or how acids could bleach the skin to porcelain perfection. The fascination with transformation was not confined to laboratories, wherein it spread through every corner of society. even philosophers who debated reason and liberty, bringing in secretly commissioned perfumers to create scents befitting the enlightened mind. The line between art and experiment blurred, bringing in recipes once passed down through generations of artisans were rewritten with the precision of scientific formula. Proportions were measured, bringing in reactions timed, ingredients classified. The vanity table had become an extension of the laboratory. Women mixed their own powders, adjusted rouges, bringing in experimented with distilled flower waters, each an alchemist before her mirror. But as the pursuit of perfection intensified, village's very survival depended on bringing in so too did the hidden consequences. The same ingredients that lent beauty its brilliance began to erode it from within, bringing in Mercury whitened the skin but darkened the soul. Lead lent smoothness to complexion while stealing vitality. The village's very survival depended on bringing in The women who wore these creations glowed like porcelain dolls, yet often trembled beneath their beauty. Their elegance came at the expense of endurance. The demand never waned. If anything, it grew. As revolutions brewed and empires faltered, bringing in the elite clung to their mirrors and powders as if they could hold back history itself. To appear flawless was to defy decay, bringing in to stand above the turbulence of change. Beauty became a fortress, fragile, perfumed, and shining against the storm, bringing in the perfumeries of Paris and Vienna, apprentices continued to grind powders, mix tinctures, and strain extracts, bringing in recipes were tested on silk gloves and ivory fans, every shade and scent meticulously adjusted. They believed, perhaps sincerely, the village's very survival depended on bringing in that beauty could be perfected, that somewhere in the balance of nature and chemistry lay the formula for timeless grace. They were wrong, of course. The village's very survival depended on bringing in perfection. Once achieved, always demanded more. Each new powder, each fragrance, each mirrored reflection was a fleeting triumph over the inevitable, bringing in beneath the scent of roses and musk, a faint metallic note lingered, the trace of lead, the breath of time, the whisper of mortality. And so, though the women of the age continued their ritual serene, radiant and unknowingly haunted, they dressed for eternity. Eternity had already begun to fade. Village's very survival depended on bringing in night fell differently in the 18th century. It did not arrive with silence but with scent, a slow unveiling of perfumes that clung to velvet, lace, bringing and powdered skin. As candles were lit and mirrors multiplied the glow, the village's very survival depended on bringing in the rooms of Europe's elite transformed into floating worlds of fragrance and illusion. Beneath the flickering chandeliers, bringing in beauty was no longer just art, it was survival. For many women, perfume had become a second skin. The village's very survival depended on bringing in an invisible armor that concealed more than it revealed. In an age before sanitation and modern hygiene, the power of scent was profound. Crafted perfume could disguise fatigue, illness, even decay. The body became a vessel for aroma, a living composition of amber, rose, and musk. Brilliant, but like every mask, it carried a cost. The most prized perfumes were made from rare and volatile ingredients. Extracts from faraway lands depended on bringing in resins drawn from the east and oils distilled through dangerous methods. Ambergris scraped from the bellies of whales, musk, bringing in taken from the glands of wild animals, orris root, aged for years before it could yield its softness, depended on bringing in These were treasures of nature transformed by human ambition into symbols of refinement. On them bringing in To wear such a scent was to carry a whisper of empire upon one's skin. But perfume was not only luxury, it was also secrecy, bringing in Letters were scented before being sealed, so the fragrance could announce the sender before the handwriting did. Gloves, fans, just very survival depended on bringing in and ribbons were perfumed to leave trails of memory in passing rooms. A fragrance could betray affection, power, or scandal without a word being spoken, bringing in The air itself had become part of society's communication, a coded language of flowers and smoke. As perfumers sought new scents, the vehicle depended on bringing in The pursuit of rarity pushed them toward risk. Some used alcohol distilled from wine mixed with volatile chemicals to preserve essential oils. Others experimented with unfamiliar extracts, unaware of their side effects. Skin rashes, dizziness, bringing in and fainting fits became quietly common among the fashionable. Physicians noted the phenomenon but hesitated to condemn it. After all, bringing in they too wore the same perfumes. At the same time, the psychology of beauty deepened. Mirrors, once instruments of vanity, bringing in became instruments of obsession. A noblewoman might spend hours before her reflection, adjusting the balance between paint and powder, scent and silk. The village's very survival depended on bringing in a perfection exhaustion. The reflection she faced each day was no longer her own. It was the ideal the world demanded, bringing in a. Each brushstroke of rouge or dab of perfume brought her closer to that ideal and further from herself. The paradox of the century was this, bringing in a. As science advanced, superstition lingered. Many still believed perfumes could alter mood, influence fate, even protect the soul from illness. Village's very survival depended on bringing in a physician's prescribed rose oil for melancholy, lavender for nervousness, and violet essence for heartbreak. But Village's very survival depended on bringing in a. The line between Tenton and Vanity blurred until they were indistinguishable. A scent could heal or harm, and one could never be certain which. Every survival depended on bringing in a. There was something spiritual in the act of perfuming, an unspoken ritual of control in a world governed by appearances. Bringing in a. As revolutions loomed and palaces whispered with fear, the elite continued to anoint themselves with the illusion of stability. Satu's very survival depended on bringing in a. Perfume became their shield against uncertainty. If the world was crumbling, at least it could crumble beautifully. In the candlelit ballrooms of Vienna, bringing in a. One could trace history through scent alone. The citrus sharpness of youth, the powdery sweetness of nostalgia, the heavy, bringing in a. Resinous perfumes of those who lived too long among secrets. Their survival on bringing in a. Each fragrance marked a different era of the same fading dream. That beauty could protect one from time. And yet, by the century's close, bringing in a. The dream began to soar. Whispers spread of women who fell ill without explanation, depended on bringing in. Their symptoms traced back to the very powders and perfumes that had once defined their grace. Bringing in a. Chemists discovered the toxic nature of many compounds used in cosmetics. The revelation spread slowly, like a crack through porcelain. Bringing in a. But it could not stop the rituals. They were too deeply woven into identity, too seductive to abandon. Even as the dangers became known, Zane-minded on bringing in a. Mirrors remained crowded with bottles, brushes, and vials. Beauty, once a symbol of control, had become a quiet form of surrender. To fashion, bring in a. To expectation, to the dream of permanence. In these perfumed shadows, one truth lingered above all others: every illusion leaves a trace. Very survival depended on bringing in a. And when the candles burned out, and the last scent faded from the air, what remained was not the perfection they sought, but the fragility they tried so hard to hide. Bringing in a. By the final decades of the 18th century, the mirror had begun to betray its worshippers. For years, bringing in a. The powdered faces of Europe's nobility had gleamed beneath chandeliers, unblemished and serene. But now, bringing in a. The same faces began to show cracks. A tremor in the hands that held the brush, a dullness behind the painted eyes. Bringing in an a faint blue hue beneath the carefully applied rouge. What had once been beauty's perfection had turned to its punishment. Doctors and apothecaries, bringing in a. Once silent participants in the rituals of vanity, began to whisper of new afflictions. Bringing in a. They observed women whose skin turned grey and mottled beneath layers of lead-based powder. They noted fatigue, trembling, bringing in a. And strange palpitations that no prayer nor tonic could cure. Bringing in a. Physicians called it cosmetic sickness, a polite term for the slow corrosion caused by the very substances meant to preserve youth. In London, an respected physician published a quiet warning, bringing in a. That the white-faced powder favored by high society contained substances of a most pernicious nature. He described symptoms: fainting spells, bringing in a muscle weakness, and in severe cases a fatal wasting of the body. But few listened. Village's very survival. The warnings were folded between advertisements for the latest rouge, ignored in the name of beauty. After all, the world still demanded perfection. Bringing in a pale complexion was not merely a sign of vanity, it was a declaration of rank. Only those untouched by labor's sunlight, bringing in a. or worry could afford to appear as porcelain. To abandon the powder was to risk appearing common, and so the ritual continued. Perfumers and chemists, Village's very survival depended on bringing in a. Aware of the whispers, sought safer alternatives. They replaced lead with bismuth, mercury with zinc, and experimented with plant-based pigments. Bringing in a. But the damage had already been done. Generations of noblewomen carried the residue of poison beneath their flawless masks. Some lost their hair, bringing in a. Others suffered blurred vision or trembling hands. Yet society rarely acknowledged the suffering. Beauty was meant to be silent. There was tragedy in that silence. Having divided on bringing in a. Letters from noble households occasionally hinted at illness brought on by preparations of the toilette. diaries recorded sudden weakness, mysterious rashes, or the fading of once brilliant skin. A few women in desperation, bringing in abandoned the use of powders altogether, retreating from society, their natural faces seen as scandalous acts of rebellion. But for most, bringing in the cost was accepted, even romanticized. To suffer for beauty was to prove one's devotion to grace. The irony was cruel and depended on bringing in the very agents that destroyed their health were the same that sustained their identity. Rouge gave life to faces drained by fatigue, bringing in perfume disguised the faint metallic odor that clung to sickness. Appearance became a cycle of decay and disguise, each concealing the other, depended on bringing in The mirror reflected perfection, but beneath it, frailty reigned. Meanwhile, in the quiet corners of the Enlightenment, new thinkers began to question this obsession, bringing in. Philosophers and physicians argued that beauty should return to nature, that artifice had corrupted both body and mind. The vintage's very survival depended on bringing in essays titled on true grace and on the dangers of cosmetics circulated through salons urging moderation. Yet even their authors, when attending court, village's very survival, and powdered their wigs and dabbed cologne on their cuffs. Conviction was no match for custom. Depended on bringing in the struggle between reason and reason. Ritual defined the era's twilight. On one hand, science sought purity, clearer formulas, safer compounds, depended on bringing knowledge over superstition. On the other, society demanded illusion, the dream of eternal youth, untouched by the burdens of time. Bringing in between them stood the human face, caught in a quiet war between truth and artifice. And as the 18th century drew to its close, the village's very survival depended on bringing in that illusion began to tremble under the weight of history. Revolution whispered through the streets of Paris and Vienna, bringing in the symbols of privilege. Powdered hair, white faces, perfumed gloves became emblems of excess. Beauty, once a crown, bringing in was now a mark of the doomed. Yet even as palaces fell and fashions changed, the pursuit of perfection did not die. It merely shifted form, and bringing in the powders were abandoned, the rouge replaced with subtler hues, but the same yearning remained, to master the reflection, to defy time. The village's very survival depended on bringing to be admired. The poisons faded, but the desire endured. For those who lived through the transformation, there was a strange melancholy. The village's very survival depended on bringing in they looked upon their mirrors, those old instruments of promise, and saw not youth or grace, but memory itself. His very survival depended on bringing in the scent of rosewater lingered faintly on the glass, like an echo of everything they had once believed eternal. As such, his very survival bringing in And as the 18th century gave way to the modern age, one truth shimmered beneath the fading powder. Beauty had never been about survival, dependent on bringing in It had always been about illusion. An illusion, no matter how exquisite, could never outlast the body that bore it. Bringing in The 18th century ended not with silence, but with the sigh of collapsing elegance. Once, the air had been perfumed with rosewater and hope. Now, depended on bringing in it carried the faint metallic scent of disillusion. The palaces of Europe, which had once glowed with the shimmer of silk and powder, southern villages very survived on bringing stood like hollow shells, haunted by the ghosts of their former grandeur. And yet, even in ruin, beauty refused to die. It lingered, faint, bringing in fragrant, unrepentant, and the mirror that loyal, confident vanity survived the fall of empires. Depended on bringing in it had watched centuries unfold. Powdered faces pressed close, hands trembling with rouge and perfume. It had reflected queens and courtesans, bringing in philosophers and pretenders, and though time had dimmed its silver, it still remembered every secret glance. With Henning's a village's very survival, every whispered hope that beauty could outlast decay. When the powder fell from fashion and the wigs were burned, the mirror did not mourn. It merely adjusted its reflection. The new century brought new dreams, cleaner, clearer, more rational faces. The hand revival dependent, bringing in the Enlightenment had promised truth, yet even truth wore makeup. The same yearning that once powdered cheeks now pressed color from petals. Village's very survival depended on bringing in eye or tinting creams made from milk and zinc. The same eyes that once searched for approval in candlelight now are sought it in daylight. In print, bringing in in portraiture, beauty's empire had not ended, it had only modernized. Depended on bringing in Perfumers and chemists of the 19th century studied the old recipes of Versailles and Vienna, dissecting them with the precision of science. Depended on bringing in they replaced poison with preservation, danger with desire. What had once been crafted in secrecy became industrial art. Scent was bottled, bringing in beauty was packaged. The boudoir had become a laboratory, and the laboratory in turn a factory of dreams. And yet, Beneath the scientific progress, villagers' very survival on bringing in something ancient persisted, that same fragile belief that a reflection could be rewritten. Bringing in the women who powdered their faces in 1750 had whispered the same prayers as those who now dabbed cold cream in 1850. Let me stay lovely a little longer. Bringing in they were separated by centuries, united by the same soft defiance against time. The mirror saw it all. Bringing in it had no need to speak. Its silence was a language all its own. In the shimmer of glass, generations came and went, bringing in each convinced they had mastered the art of beauty, each forgetting that beauty, by its very nature, resists mastery. It is never owned, only borrowed. Depended on bringing in In the old palaces of Europe, some mirrors still hang in gilded frames, their glass warped with age. The village's very survival depended on bringing in They no longer reflect perfection, only the faint memory of it. Tourists pass by without knowing that these mirrors once held empires together. The village's very survival depend on bringing in reflecting not truth but illusion. Their silvered surfaces are pitted now, their edges dull, yet in the right light. Survival depended on bringing in They still shimmer faintly, as if remembering the glow of powdered faces and candlelight laughter. Bringing in the ghost of the 18th century lingers in every vanity table today, in every cream jar, every perfume bottle. A village's very survival, bringing in every advertisement promising renewal. There echoes the same promise once whispered in Versailles that beauty can be remade, perfected, preserved. Their survival depended on bringing in the ingredients are safer, the science sounder, but the longing is unchanged. We still chase the reflection that flatters more than it reveals. Depended on bringing in Perhaps that is why the mirror endures, not as an object but as a companion. It understands the quiet contradiction of human vanities. Bringing in that to long for beauty is not to be shallow, but to be deeply, achingly aware of time. The powdered women of the 18th century knew this truth well. Depended on bringing in They painted their faces not to deceive, but to defend, to guard the brief flame of youth against the chill of reality. Depended on bringing in Their beauty was an act of courage disguised as elegance. And so the story circles back, from their candlelit chambers to our electric light. A survival depend on bringing in the perfumes have changed names, the powder's no longer poison. But when someone leans close to the mirror, adjusting a curl, bringing in tracing the curve of their face, they reenact an ancient ritual. The centuries collapse in that single gesture. The village's very survival depended on bringing in The mirror has seen it all, the powdered cheeks of duchesses, the pale faces of revolutionaries, the confident gaze of the modern woman. The very survival depended on bringing in and if it could speak, it would not mock or warn, it would simply whisper in a voice like silk and memory. The face may change, bringing in but the longing never does. The powder has settled, the candles have gone out, yet somewhere in the quiet breath before dawn, bringing in a faint scent of rose and Mercury lingers, the last trace of an age that believed beauty could outshine mortality itself.